Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. This will be a very important video for anyone that is interested to understand what's the situation on the front line. About every half a year or so, the type of war that Ukraine and Russia is fighting, it changes pretty significantly. And right now, we exactly passed another one of these turns, and the war has changed once again. So in this frontline update that we're doing weekly, I'm going to dive into the new doctrine that is going to be prevalent on the front lines, and we're going to mention some of the things that are happening on the front lines as well, and some of the Ukrainian counterattacks kicking the Russians out where they don't belong. Firstly, let's recap what type of warfare we were fighting before and from which we moved away from. The type of warfare we were fighting was the Russian heavy onslaught with the vehicles, when they were driving big columns of trucks and vehicles, and then Ukrainians used drones to strike these columns. Since then, Russians have increased their drone production output, and they've also adjusted their tactics because they don't have as much vehicles. They've tried using a lot of the bikes, but bikes had certain issues with becoming an absolutely dominant way of conducting warfare, because Ukrainians are also quickly realized how the bikes are used, and as soon as the bike group is being caught, even on the bikes, they still would get pretty heavily eliminated, and it still was problematic. So the war changed significantly as Russia now is using a lot more aviation bombs, and it's using silent infiltration tactics to help establish themselves. So let's look at the example right over here. So beforehand, we would have some kind of a front line. We would have some kind of positions on that front line. This was problematic for Ukrainians to hold, and specifically to hold it like it would be the Second World War, because the previous doctrines would require sending a lot of the forces inside of that trench. Unfortunately for Ukrainians, Russians, by using their planes with aviation bombs, they would bomb heavily the Ukrainian positions. So if Ukrainians would concentrate their forces in these trench lines, it would cause significant damage to the defenders. And Ukraine cannot really fight like that. Ukraine cannot just sacrifice non-stop people just to have the density inside of their positions on the right level, so to stop any kind of Russian offensive. This led to the next step of evolution as a response to the Russian attacks from the sky, is that there were still trenches and trenched positions, but now Ukrainians started using fewer people. And it worked for a while. The problem became a bit later when Russians started using this motorcycle tactics. Because with motorcycle tactics, it turned out that if there is not a lot of people in your trenches, then they can be very quickly overwhelmed by motorcycles, as it's fast-moving target, and you don't have the density of troops necessary to actually kill all of the advancing forces, especially if it is paired together with the aviation bombs that are destroying Ukrainian positions. This changed the way that Ukrainians are approaching to their positions. Now, open trenches are pretty much non-existent. They are considered to be a bad position to be in. Right now, it is either like a proper position when it's if it's a ground level, there may be like a small dugout with like a small hole where you can see what is happening, and then it's very hard to notice this position, so it's fully masked. Or if it's just some kind of a building, or it is just like a tree line where you have a hidden position in a tree line. So the small positions, well-hidden positions, became the name of the game. So there would be very few Ukrainian people stuck in these positions, and they would be trying to look at the Russians. And what would often happen is that if there would be like a position here, position here, position here, position here, when the Russians would advance, oftentimes Ukrainians would actually not even engage the Russians from their hidden positions. Instead, they report to their drone operators that were located in the back, that, hey, by the way, there is a group of Russians that are advancing on this direction. We are not engaging them because they will just destroy us. So instead, the drone operators would engage Russians attacking on the bikes and destroy these positions. And when the Russians would kind of dismount and try to hide, then suddenly they would find out, oh, wow, there were actually Ukrainians all around here all along. That was the tactic kind of preceding the current new defense. But this led to the new evolution that we are right now seeing, which is Russians saying, well, if Ukrainians are hidden, why don't we be hidden as well? So what they're doing is they're trying, under the guise of night, they're trying to find which are the safe routes where during the night you can kind of move along, and they would have some kind of drone that would follow them, and they would wear some kind of a thermal capes that would allow them to kind of get through. And therefore, even if Ukrainians had drones patrolling some of the areas, potentially they would find a hole in this defense to then get through. And then they would get through, they would dig in somewhere, they would not reveal themselves, and they will just radio to the opposing forces that, hey, by the way, we are there. So now then we'll send the second group, and then the third group, and so on and so on. And once there is a certain mass accumulated in the area, then they would reveal themselves, and then they would try to engage Ukrainians in the positions if they reveal, or openly support this area. And more importantly, they would start openly asking for reinforcements, at which time then the Russians, as the fighting is already going on with their forward forces, the Russians would just send in some of their additional forces into the area. The problem that this is not a dedicated tactic. So it's not like the Russians are knowing, okay, we need to go in that specific direction, and then there will be like a place where we can get. No, everything is happening pretty fast. So this situation can happen like overnight. So overnight, Russians will just accumulate to then in the morning cause havoc and then start attacking, and then the next morning there is like already fighting going on. But as I said, this happens very quickly. And most importantly, it happens for Russian in all directions. So if, for example, there is some kind of Russian salient, let's say this one, we'll take this as an example, while their primary direction is this one, the one that they want to attack to, with their current tactic, they're actually trying to move into all directions at night as right away. They send in 2 people, essentially every couple hundred meters, just to go into the direction towards the supposed enemy. And then when they advance, then they said, oh, we advanced 300 meters, 500 meters, we secured ourselves, go in, follow our tracks. And then the next group, and then the next group, and then the next group. And then, next morning, there is now a big Russian attack. Supposedly, they're appearing out of nowhere. And now it's fighting, and Ukrainians are overwhelmed, and Russians are taking the position. And the problem with that is that the tactic with having drone patrols, everything doesn't really have with fast and intense fighting, because drones need to time to find the targets, strike the targets, confirm the targets, then resupply the drone and so on. Drones are not a very fast weapons. That's why they are much better against when Russians are all packed together on one tank, and then the tank gets blown up, and then the drones slowly clean up Russians in the area. It doesn't really help when there is like fighting happening in just within like half an hour or an hour in the morning, and then there's already so many Russians that it's already becoming problematic. And more importantly, Russia has adapted their drone tactic. If you would compare frontline, you would find out very interesting situation that in general, Ukrainians have drones very much present in all parts of the front line. All of the Ukrainian units will have drones that are able to fight the Russians, and they would have more of these drones than Russians. So Russians would cry that they cannot do anything because there are Ukrainian drones everywhere. But Russians have adapted. What they've created is they've created so-called Rubicon units. And Rubicon units is basically densely packed, highly professional, as much as it can be for this, but like very experienced drone operators that are extremely mobile. So what the Rubicon does is once Russians have established themselves and are fighting for certain positions, or there is expected to be fight for certain positions, then these Rubicon units are sent to this part of the front line to create a temporary dense drone advantage. So for the specific area where the fighting is happening, Russians just completely cover the skies with drones. They try to suppress the enemy drones, and they just try to suppress enemy forces, in this case Ukrainian forces, therefore bringing a lot of benefits for Russians, specifically where it matters. The problem with that is again because of the Russian tactic, because it is not a dedicated tactic, because they can advance multiple directions. Sometimes the command structure is not good enough, and oftentimes Rubicon units, they don't arrive on time. They arrive much later, for example, half a day later than the fighting is already happening. And if Ukrainians, for example, had enough forces in the area, then suddenly it is becoming really problematic for Rubicon to actually change something on the front line. And now we're getting to the actual new doctrine that we're probably gonna see. We already see changing it by the decisions made from the armed forces of Ukraine and decisions made also from Russian. And that doctrine is that there are essentially frontline units that basically almost don't fight each other. So there are the infiltration units, and then there are observation units from Ukrainian side and potentially counter-infiltration units, because we already got reports of Ukrainians infiltrating. And these are usually very lightly armored. They might have some supplies, and maybe some supplies additionally later dropped to them by drones, but their point is to conduct essentially maneuver warfare that you would have in the Second World War with tanks. They want to do it right now with humans. So they want to get behind the enemy lines very deep, as far as they can, get as many people as they can, and then kind of start attacking the sides and spread out and get additional reinforcements in the area. So this is everything that we talked about up until now. But there is already a response to that there will be not only the frontline fighting, but there will be special units at the back. Because what I said is that there are units that are infiltrating behind the enemy lines, and these units are very lightly armored. And lightly armored are struggling against what? Exactly, heavy armored. So vehicles, tanks, everything that is heavily armored will be the fast response units. So when this infiltration group that is maybe lightly armored, maybe have some anti-tank capabilities, but very limited, suddenly they start getting hammered by tanks up close, being hammered by infantry fighting vehicles, heavy machine guns, heavy fighting, and so on, then suddenly this group loses very quickly. And even if the attacking mobile group like a Rubicon, the drone mobile group, arrives, because Ukrainians are making these groups now as well, even if this drone groups arrives, maybe they can still fly, maybe they can even destroy a vehicle or two, but the whole advance is already gone. That's it. Like you already failed with your infiltration tactic, and you already seen this tactic applied somewhere. It's in a sort of a rough state, was applied obviously here in Pokrovsk, where this was the salient that Russians just suddenly found an ability to advance somewhere up north. And as we're now getting reports and reviews like of this action, it was actually a fuck up from both sides. It was a big error from Ukrainian side that they allowed a lot of Russians to infiltrate their positions, but it was also error from the Russian side, because when they actually infiltrated and some of the forward units actually went in to support but then the Rubicon area, like that's supposed to supply this heavy weapon support, the drone support, they actually didn't get the message. And there was a lot of disorganization. So when the Ukrainian counter-attacking forces came in, then the counter-attacking forces very quickly were able to do a lot of damage to the Russian attacking forces. And when the Rubicon finally arrived, it was already a little bit too late. And the same kind of thing happened also here up north. So here was Kupiansk situation during this last week, where Russians controlled an area around Ratskivka, north of Kupiansk, and then they infiltrated Mirny, and people started crying wolf, that everything is lost. that Kupiansk is going to be encircled right now, everything is going to be lost forever. But then suddenly Ukrainians now are attacking by using heavy vehicles that Russia actually doesn't have the forces here to stop. And this whole salient is again cut off because they don't possess a lot of heavy equipment in the area. And now Kupiansk is again more safe than it was during this supposed attack. So long story short, the front lines will make even less sense for you going forward whatsoever. Because if there are units that are not going to be really engaging each other with like dedication on the front lines, obviously there's going to be some fighting, but not like we're on the front, therefore we must kill the enemy. No, it's going to be sometimes like we must not be seen by enemy, and the other is like we need to report the enemy but not actually disclose ourselves. That is pretty possible to be a front line. And then you have the highly mobile units of counter force fighting, whether it's on the attacking side that are going to bring a lot of intense drone capabilities to secure local air superiority, or it's going to be the defending side, active fighting groups that Syrskyi right now is building from the best assault forces that he has. He is building these fast response assaulting groups on heavy armor that will be able to just clear up the positions that are not fortified and not well defended with any kind of heavy weapons by the infiltrated Russians. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you also understood a little bit more the nature of this changing war. We're continuing supporting Ukrainian armed forces. We're continuing trusting Ukrainian armed forces. They are truly amazing. And as we can see, no frontline breakthroughs are happening despite the Russian claims and despite Gerasimov showing the map with the fantasy advances of Russians. But we're going to talk about it tomorrow. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini. And I'll see you next time.